In this video, you will find the location of our treasures.
While the Viking raids in England and France yielded massive piles of extorted silver, the economic engine of the era operated in the East. It was a sophisticated trade network stretching across the continent. Swedish Norsemen, known as the Russ or Varangians, pushed their fleets down the unmapped river systems of Eastern Europe, driving toward the markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. They exchanged northern monopolies like furs, amber, and slaves for silver. Millions of Arabic dirhams flooded back into the northern world. This created a logistical problem. The Varangians accumulated physical silver faster than they could spend it, leaving them to cache their wealth in the ground across thousands of miles of territory. Before we locate the exact coordinates of these undiscovered eastern vaults, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Finding these hoards means identifying the specific points where human psychology intercepts raw geography. Every fleet returning from the eastern rivers eventually navigated through the Baltic Sea. The island of Gotland sat directly in the middle of this maritime highway as a mandatory stopover. The soil here holds the densest concentration of Viking wealth ever recorded. Archaeologists have uncovered more than 800 individual hoards on this single island, totaling over 170,000 silver coins. Gotland was inhabited by peasant harborers, wealthy farmers who functioned as international merchants. They buried their trading capital directly beneath their farmhouses for safekeeping. Search targets on Gotland include the soil perimeters surrounding early medieval farmsteads, the natural limestone caves dotting the coast, and the old boundary walls separating historic properties. Further west, late 10th century Denmark presents a different pattern. King Harald Bluetooth centralized his power by constructing massive geometric military bases known as ring fortresses. These structures housed thousands of elite warriors returning from overseas campaigns with heavy pockets of bullion. When internal civil wars broke out across Denmark, soldiers hid their wealth near the fortress walls. Their burial sites are highly specific: the external marshy defensive ditches and the immediate corridors leading to the entry gates. These Baltic hoards represent merchant-driven wealth accumulation disrupted by sudden geopolitical instability. Moving into the eastern river networks of the Dnieper and Volga basins changes the geography. These waterways were interrupted by violent rapids, forcing crews to drag their ships across land portages. These bottlenecks were dangerous. Hostile nomadic tribes, like the Pechenegs, used these forced land crossings as natural ambush zones to attack vulnerable Viking fleets. Crews facing an imminent attack engaged in panic caching. They buried their silver bullion directly on the riverbank, hoping to retrieve it if they survived the encounter. These emergency survival caches are found on high bluffs overlooking ancient river rapids and along the historical overland portage pathways. If a merchant fleet survived the journey, they arrived at early Rus trading fortresses like Staria Latica and Novgorod. These cities operated on a multi-currency economy where silver was constantly cut, weighed, and stolen. This resulted in hacksilver being scattered across the agricultural fields within a 5-mile radius of the settlement walls. While the Baltic vaults were methodical, these river caches are records of emergency survival, dictated entirely by choke point geography. A massive percentage of Viking wealth was buried with no intention of retrieval. Norse pagan culture viewed watery environments as direct portals to the spirit world. Sacrificing wealth to the gods was a structured religious practice to ensure a safe voyage or entry into Valhalla. The primary hotspots for these deposits are low-lying peat bogs that directly border ancient sacrificial hills or pagan burial mounds. During seasonal rituals, crafted silver neck rings and elite weapons were deliberately cast into the dark water. The oxygen-free environment of these bogs acts as a time capsule, preserving both the metal and organic materials in near-perfect condition for over a millennium. Hunting for wetland hoards involves mapping the spiritual topography of the Norse world. Viewed at a continental scale, the ground reveals a highly structured network of historical events. Every hoard left behind aligns with the specific logic of human behavior reacting to local geography. We can trace merchant accumulation in the Baltic, combat panic along the eastern river bottlenecks, and religious devotion in the Scandinavian bogs. By understanding why a crew buried their bullion, Archaeologists can accurately predict the locations where wealth remains hidden under modern topographies. The landscape of Europe is a living record. It is a silent vault where Norse wealth still waits under the soil.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something seriously fascinating. We are going on a journey to totally demystify the hidden map of Viking wealth that is, quite literally, lying right beneath our feet. We're going to decode the exact geographical, tactical, and environmental factors that led to massive Viking fortunes being buried all across Europe. So if you've ever wondered where and why history's most notorious seafarers stashed their silver, you are definitely in the right place. Okay, let's dive right into this by completely busting a classic myth. Go ahead and forget all those pirate movies you've seen with a big red X marking the spot on some random sandy beach. The reality, it was far more calculated. Viking hoards were deposited based on incredibly strict rules of survival, the flow of ancient trade routes, and the precise geography of river networks. They didn't just bury things by accident, guys. They were highly, highly strategic. So, here's our geographic tour for today. We'll start with the Viking Earth Bank. Head over to England's Danelaw, check out the Irish and Scottish coasts, sail down to France's extortion rivers, and then wrap the whole thing up with a geographic probability matrix. I promise you, by the end of this explainer, you're going to be able to read the European landscape like a Norse chieftain. All right, part 1, the Viking Earth Bank. To figure out where all this treasure is most likely buried today, we really have to get into the mindset of the people who buried it. And the most crucial thing to remember is that the Vikings obviously didn't have modern banks with vaults and pin codes. For them, the earth itself was their vault. But what exactly were they depositing? Well, wealth in the Viking Age wasn't just neatly minted coins. It was actually measured in bullion. We're talking about heavy silver arm rings and something called hacksilver. These were literally chopped up pieces of silver items, think cut up bowls, broken jewelry, or ingots, that they used as currency by weight. This bullion formed the absolute backbone of the Viking economy. Now, what's really interesting here is that there were basically 3 strict historical rules governing why all this silver went into the ground in the first place. First up, emergency cash. If a raiding party got cornered by an enemy or just had to move fast, they'd bury their heavy silver intending to come back for it later. But if they died in battle, well, that treasure was essentially frozen in time. Second rule, trade security. Savvy Viking merchants would actually bury their trading capital near major river junctions or markets while they went off to negotiate, basically keeping it safe from rival raiders. And third, religious offerings. According to Norse mythology, specifically the Ynglinga saga, a warrior could enjoy in Valhalla whatever wealth he buried in the earth while he was alive. So burying silver was kind of like setting up a 401k for the afterlife. Moving right along to part 2, England, the Danelaw, and its rivers. Back in the 9th century, England was the primary target for the Great Heathen Army. The country got sliced up between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Viking-ruled territory we know as the Danelaw. This created a massive, volatile collision zone where wealth was constantly changing hands. And in this zone, rivers were literally everything. The northwest coast of England basically acted as a direct maritime highway, connecting Viking Dublin over in Ireland straight to Viking York in England. Because they relied on rivers like the Ribble, the Mersey, and the Lune as inland highways, ancient floodplains and historical low-water fords became extremely high-probability zones for buried wealth. Think about it. If you're being chased by an angry Anglo-Saxon army, muddy riverbanks are absolutely the quickest place to stash your heavy hacksilver. Just to wrap our heads around the staggering scale of wealth moving along these river highways, consider this number: 8,600. That is the exact number of items discovered in the Cuverdale hoard, right on the banks of the River Ribble. It's literally the single largest Viking silver hoard ever found in Western Europe. It is a perfect illustration of just how heavily utilized these specific transit routes were. Heading a bit further inland, we hit the York hinterlands. York, or Jorvik, was the absolute capital of Scandinavian power in England, and the countryside around it was divided up among Viking veterans who settled down to farm. A brilliant example of the wealth hidden out here is the Harrogate Hoard. It was found in an agricultural field near a historic route with elevated high ground. But what's truly mind-blowing about this specific hoard is that it contains silver from as far away as Samarkand. It just goes to show how deeply plugged in these rural English farmsteads were to a massive global trade network. Let's cross the water for Section 3, Ireland and Scotland's coasts. Over in Ireland, the whole Viking strategy totally shifts. They move away from massive land battles and pivot straight into coastal raiding slave trading ports, and isolated island fortresses. In Ireland, the landscape of wealth is completely defined by the Longford. Before the Vikings built permanent stone cities like modern-day Dublin, they built these fortified naval enclosures along major rivers like the Shannon and the Liffey. These were highly secure fortified bases designed to shelter their longships and, of course, store the massive amounts of plunder they were pulling out of the Irish countryside. So the crucial point here is if you're looking for Viking wealth in Ireland, you have to look around these long forts. The spatial prompts are actually incredibly specific. Basically, you want to look within a 10-mile radius of a historical Viking base. High probability targets include muddy banks, paleo channels, which are extinct river paths that have since dried up, and the marshy boundaries surrounding early monastic sites. These were the exact specific environments where raiders would temporarily stash their loot before hauling it back to the main Longfort. Now, if we head north up to Scotland's Atlantic Seaway, places like the Hebrides and Orkney, we find regions that were completely Scandinavianized. These northern and western isles weren't just targets for raids. They acted as the absolutely crucial maritime staging ground for Viking fleets gearing up to launch attacks down onto England and Ireland. Since this was all about maritime staging, the hiding spots totally reflect that focus. The high-probability targets up here include coastal Machar soils. Those are the really fertile sandy plains near the beaches, along with cliffs that overlook natural bays where you could easily beach a longship. And honestly, the perimeters of early Christian hermitages on remote islands are massive hotspots too. The famous 2014 Galloway Hoard is a prime example of this. It showed us exactly how Vikings hid these priceless multicultural treasures, stuff like Anglo-Saxon silver and really delicate Irish glass, right there in isolated ecclesiastical lands. All right, down south we go for part 4, France and the extortion rivers. When we look at mainland Western Europe, the wealth extraction method totally upgraded. They moved away from basic hit-and-run raiding and evolved into something way more systematic, straight-up extortion. This is where we get the concept of Danegeld. These were massive, crippling payments in silver made by terrified Frankish kings who were essentially paying the Vikings off so they wouldn't burn down major cities like Paris. We are talking about millions of silver coins changing hands here. And to protect these massive payouts from rival Norse factions, the Vikings buried a ton of this extorted wealth right along the banks of the Seine River network. The absolute epicenter for this mafia-style activity was the lower Seine Valley. The Vikings sailed up the Seine so many times to lay siege to Paris that the extortion became completely institutionalized. Eventually, the Frankish king got so desperate, he simply granted the Viking leader, Rollo, the land at the mouth of the river just to act as a buffer. And that land literally became known as the Land of the Northmen, or Normandy. So when we track the wealth in this region, the high probability spots map perfectly onto exactly where those extortion camps were pitched. We're looking at island formations right inside the Seine River itself, historical crossing points near the city of Rouen, and the dense defensive forest perimeters flanking the river valleys. These natural geographical features gave them the perfect defenses to secure their hard-earned Danegeld. Let's move to part 5 and see how this all builds into our geographic probability matrix. We've covered a ton of ground, so let's synthesize these regional tactics into one clear system. Think of this as your ultimate cheat sheet. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how predictable these treasure depositions can actually be. Take northwest England, for example. The indicators there are river bends and fords, driven purely by the logic of military transit between Dublin and York, giving us massive hoards like Cuerdale. Drop down to the Irish valleys, and the focus shifts to river confluences near monasteries, all for Longford storage. Up in the Scottish Islands, it's coastal Mahare and cliffs used for maritime staging. And finally, down in northern France, it's all about river islands and paleo channels to protect those giant Danegeld extortion payments. It's amazing, right? The geography perfectly matches the history. So, what does this all mean? The big takeaway from our explainer today is that this massive, dense trail of silver left across the British Isles and France wasn't just random chance. It was a highly organized system completely driven by military panic, the absolute necessity of river navigation, and the incredibly lucrative business of extortion. The Viking Earth Bank was perfectly logical, and, as we've seen, it was highly mapped to the natural environment. But here is the absolute wildest part of this whole story. We have literally only just covered the Western theater, which leaves us with a massive, provocative question. Where on earth did the rest of the world's wealth go? Because the Vikings didn't just look west. In fact, the absolute greatest volume of Viking silver didn't come from England or France at all. It came from the east, from the legendary Islamic caliphates and the Byzantine Empire. So how in the world did millions of Arabic silver dirhams end up buried in the freezing soils of the Baltic Sea? Well, that is a fascinating geographic puzzle, and it's exactly what we're going to uncover in part 2. Keep learning, keep analyzing the landscape around you, and I will see you in the next explainer.